Glory to Ukraine. I'm Oleg Christopher, and this is a story for adults. Please subscribe to our channel and support us on Facebook. Hello, this is Alphonse, an attack drone pilot from the 68th Brigade. With me is the chaplain, who's also the communications specialist for the 68th Brigade. We set up communication for the guys because we love hearing updates like this from them. It's music to our ears, and to hear about successful hits more often, we reached out to the charitable foundation of Group 35 and the community of Ukraine's main historical bloggers. We're raising funds for over 200 FPV drones for the 68th Brigade. The year is 2021. On the eve of the full-scale invasion, Russian President Putin once again repeats his anti-historical myths that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that Lenin created Ukraine, and that Ukraine stole historical Russian land. During the creation of the Soviet Union, the native Russian territories, which have absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine, never had any connection to it. All this, of course, is nonsense. When you carefully study the issue, it turns out that everything is exactly the opposite. Russia was created by Ukrainians, and it was Russia that took away the ethnic territories of Ukrainians. Now, we'll talk about this in detail. Our distant ancestors lived in a state called Rus, with its capital in Kyiv. At its peak, this nation stretched from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. Then came the Mongol invasion, and the northeastern territories fell under the rule of the Horde for several centuries. It was then that the Moscow Principality emerged there, which slowly began to occupy neighboring principalities. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian lands became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus and Samogitia, and Poland. Vik, at the height of its power, also stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. These stones are more than 600 years old. The so-called Vytautas Tower next to the Hrebla-Kochovska hydroelectric power station. A reminder of the times when this land belonged to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus and Samogitia. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde is disintegrating, and Muscovy is making territorial claims to all the former principalities of Rus, as well as to the Horde lands. Continuous wars between the Muscovites and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania began. In the summer of 1514, after a month-long siege, the Muscovite army captured Smolensk, and by the end of August reached the left bank of the Dnieper, not far from Orsha. The Muscovite army numbered almost 80,000 soldiers. Prince Ostrozky commanded up to 30,000 troops. He managed to exploit the contradictions between the Moscow boyars and completely defeat them. As for his hetman, the outstanding Prince Konstantin Ivanovich Ostrozky, may God grant him much health and happiness for the future, so that he may continue to defeat the Muscovite army as he has done now. May he defeat the Tatar horde, shedding their Busurman blood, as recorded in a short Kiev chronicle of the 16th century. In 1648, the Ukrainian Cossacks, led by Hetman Bohdan Khmelnytsky, rebelled against Poland and created their own state, the Hetmanate. And in 1654, under an agreement with Muscovy, they became part of it with autonomous rights. Subsequently, within the territories of Muscovy, and later the Russian Empire, there were effectively 3 Ukrainian autonomous states with different statuses. The southern part was the territory of the Zaporozhian Sich. To the north was the Hetmanate with its regimental system. In the east was Slobozhanshkina. We will talk about it in one of the upcoming episodes of The Time Machine. What stands out is this: a significant part of Ukrainian lands is now part of Russia. This system persisted until the end of the 18th century, when Catherine II abolished the autonomy of the Hetmanate and Slobozhanskaya and destroyed the Zaporizhian Sich. The Ukrainian lands were then divided into ordinary imperial provinces. In fact, there were no administrative borders with the name Ukraine, Great Russia, or Belarus in the Russian Empire. There were only small exceptions for the Kingdom of Poland and Finland. Everything else was essentially divided into provinces. The boundaries and names of these provinces were constantly changing. Russia also tried to assimilate Ukrainians and prove that Russians and Ukrainians were actually one people. Despite the constant bans on the Ukrainian language, even the first all-Russian census proved that Ukrainians existed and were the majority in large territories. Actually, the first all-Russian census, the General Population Census conducted in 1897, provided accurate information about the settlement of Ukrainians in the Russian Empire. It clearly showed by districts and volosts where Ukrainians formed the majority. Back then, ethnicity was determined by the language people spoke. As we can see, in all the provinces that were on the territory of present-day Ukraine, Ukrainians constituted the majority. The only exception was the Taurida province with Crimea, but even there a relative majority spoke Ukrainian. The starting point for Ukraine's western borders, as well as any of its borders, is the emergence of ethnographic maps. These ethnographic maps appear showing us the areas where Ukrainians settled. However, each ethnographic map isn't an exact document. Ukrainians tended to use those ethnographic maps that gave them the largest possible territory. The seizure of their ethnic territory, and when we talk about the Western territories, of course, we're referring to what we now know and understand as the Kolm region, which is the area beyond the Bug River in modern-day Poland, essentially Galicia-Posen. In 1917, during the final stages of World War I, a revolution broke out in the Russian Empire. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. The empire ceased to exist. Power transferred to the provisional government. Ukrainians quickly formed their own prototype of a parliament, the Central Rada, which expressed its desire to establish national territorial autonomy. The question of borders immediately arose. The main criterion was determined to be ethnographic. Ukraine was to become a land continuously populated by Ukrainians. They based this on the results of the all-Russian census of 1897. It turned out that drawing borders along the boundaries of governorates was not appropriate, as these borders were originally not drawn according to ethnographic principles. In total, Ukrainians lived across 19 governorates. The Ukrainian delegation, led by Volodymyr Venichenko, which went to Petrograd for negotiations, proposed to temporarily establish Ukrainian borders within the provinces where Ukrainians constitute the majority. Regarding the rest of the Ukrainian lands, they proposed to continue dialogue. This included separating non-Ukrainian parts from these provinces and conversely incorporating Ukrainian areas. The composition of the Ukrainian region, including Ukrainian parts from adjacent provinces, such as Kolm, Grodno, Minsk, Kursk, Voronezh, Kuban region and others, was to be determined by the regional council, in agreement with the provisional government and the population of these territories. This was outlined in the Declaration on the Affairs of the National Committee. However, the Russian Democrats quickly reached an impasse on the Ukrainian question. The Ukrainian leaders of the Central Rada, particularly Hrushevsky, when drafting a memorandum with which the delegation traveled to Petrograd, but he mentioned that in the future, borders would need to be clarified. Even though Ukraine would have 9 provinces, Ukrainians weren't welcome there. Vinichenko wrote extensively about this in his Revival of the Nation, noting that the so-called Democrats turned out to be even bigger chauvinists than the Russian chauvinists themselves. In post-imperial Russia at that time, there were many versions of Reformation. I'm bringing this up because Lenin appealed to him. So this Konstantin Fortunatov actually proposed dividing all of Russia, the Great Russia, into 16 states. In the end, Ukrainians chose not to wait for the weather from Petrograd and announced Ukraine as the territory of those provinces where they were an absolute majority.
Despite the statute from Petrograd, the first universal was issued where Ukraine practically stated that if discussions about this were not held with it, it would do everything by default. Many in Russia perceived this as tantamount to secession from Russia. There were big scandals. Still, a delegation from Russia arrived, headed by Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky, to discuss these issues. This delegation was made up of people who were more or less sympathetic towards Ukraine. During these discussions, the territorial question was raised amidst these discussions. The discussion included 9 provinces where Ukrainians were the majority of the population, excluding the Kuban region because it was not a complete territory. Instead, the Bessarabian province was added to the 9 provinces again for economic reasons. Unfortunately, this principle wasn't officially documented during these negotiations. That is, what was discussed about it, Vinnychenko gave interviews about it at the time, and later Territorial recalled that the principle was agreed upon. Where Ukrainians are the majority, that's Ukraine, the final definition. The UPR, regarding the inclusion of parts of Kursk, Kolm, Voronezh regions, as well as adjacent provinces where the majority of the population is Ukrainian, should be established with the consent of the people's harmonized will, according to the Third Universal of the Ukrainian Central Rada. In Russia, all stages of accepting the inevitable took place in succession. The denial of Ukraine's emergence was replaced by anger, and then bargaining began. A more reactionary government came to power than before, and it, on August 17th, August 4th, Old Style, 1917, issued a temporary instruction that limited the territory of Ukraine to 5 provinces instead of the actual 10 or theoretical 45. Depression was supposed to follow, and finally acceptance. But a coup occurred in Russia, and the Bolsheviks came to power. In words, Lenin and his associates recognized the right to independence. But in practice, they started a war of aggression. By February, Morovov's army had already captured Kiev. Around the same time, peace negotiations with Germany and Austria-Hungary took place in Brest. The participants were both Soviet Russia and the Ukrainian People's Republic. After Ukraine had already signed the Treaty of Brest, and then Russia was forced to sign it as well, one of the conditions for Russia was also the recognition of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The territory that Russia then recognized as part of the Ukrainian People's Republic was much larger than Ukraine's current borders. For example, Starodubshchina was part of the country. The question of Crimea's affiliation is complicated. Initially, in 1917, the Central Rada renounced the peninsula. In Crimea, the formation of a Crimean Tatar state began. Well, in the end, Ukrainians really didn't constitute the majority there. However, in the spring of 1918, by order of the Ukrainian People's Republic government, a Crimean campaign was carried out by a unit of the Ukrainian army under the command of Petro Bolbochin. But near Sevastopol, he had a conflict with the German military, who demanded that the Ukrainians leave the peninsula. The Kiev government shamefully abandoned its troops in Crimea. Soon after, the military turned against the government, resulting in a coup that brought Hetman Skoropadsky to power. He was interested in Crimea, by the way, and not just Crimea. On May 1st, 1918, German troops entered the city of Taganrog. The city itself was 1/3 Ukrainian. However, in the surrounding area, Ukrainians formed the ethnic majority. Soon after, a delegation from Taganrog traveled to Kyiv. They went to ask Skoropadsky to incorporate the region into Ukraine. The hetman was hesitant to make a decision, as this land was also claimed by the entire Don army, led by Ataman Krasnov, which was incidentally independent from Russia. And it didn't matter that Krasnov's forces were essentially separatists, even from the Don region. Eventually, after negotiations, Taganrog was ceded to the independent Don. Soon after, a new war between Russia and Ukraine began. The war is coming to an end. Germany, which had supported Skoropadsky's Ukrainian state, is withdrawing from the war and facing defeat. Russia is announcing that it won't recognize any of the agreements they made, and in some cases, they're not even recognizing Ukraine. In Ukraine, the Directory comes to power while Lenin's Russia quickly creates its own hybrid Ukraine, the so-called temporary government. This workers' and peasants' government first meets in Kursk and then in Sudzha in the Starodub region. Now this is territory of the Russian Federation. On January 22, 1919, a solemn proclamation of the Act of Unification takes place in St. Sophia Square in Kiev. At least on paper, Ukraine is almost 1.5 times larger than it is today, both to the east and north as well as to the west. It's very easy to draw a desirable border on a map. Yes, it looks great on the wall when there's a map with nice borders, but we're talking about a cruel time. A tough period of the nation's struggle for self-determination. This is when not only Ukrainians, but also Ukraine's western neighbors like Poles, Romanians, and others appeared on the world's political map. The truth was they had their own nation states, but they wanted to expand their borders after World War I. So the competition began, sometimes diplomatic and, unfortunately, sometimes armed. With the Poles, things were quite harsh in those times. There were Polish-Ukrainian wars, or one war, you can interpret it differently, in which Ukraine actually lost. At the beginning of 1920, Petliura formed a military alliance with Poland. This treaty was accompanied by significant territorial losses. We know about the Warsaw Agreement between Pilsudski and Petliura, where the Ukrainian People's Republic ceded Volhynian territories and eastern Galicia to Poland. In the end, this western border remained after the defeat of Ukrainians by Bolshevik Russia. The eastern border was still changing frequently. More details in the next episode. Ignorance of history does not absolve one from responsibility.
During Skoropadsky's Ukrainian state, our territories expanded significantly. Compared to the Central Rada era, under the Hetmanate, Ukrainian authority spread to new territories in the east: Putyvl, Sudzha, Grayvoron, Rilsk, Belgorod, Korchan, and Novuskol districts of Kursk province, as well as the Valiki district of Voronezh province. A Ukrainian administration was established in these lands, Elena Boyko. However, a new Russian-Ukrainian war soon broke out, and the so-called Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic appeared on Ukrainian territory. As World War I was ending, Germany, which had supported Skoropadsky's Ukrainian state, was withdrawing from the war, suffering defeat. Russia declared that it wouldn't recognize any of the agreements. They had concluded not even acknowledging Ukraine. And from that point on, from December 1918 until 1991, when we're talking about the border, when we talk about the border between Russia and Ukraine, we're actually referring to the border between Soviet Ukraine and Soviet Russia. Interestingly, the so-called temporary workers and peasants government formed in the Kremlin actually started with territorial claims against Russia. Given the natural connection between the Belgorod district and the Kharkov province, the Provisional Workers and Peasants government of Ukraine decided to annex the Belgorod district to the Kharkov region, following a petition from the Belgorod Revolutionary Committee. However, they later had to give up Belgorod, as the so-called Ukrainian government made no secret of who they really served. The Provisional Workers and Peasants government of Ukraine was established by a resolution. It was an organ of the Russian Communist Party Committee and carried out all orders and directives from the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party without question. Christian Rakovsky was the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Ukrainian SSR in 1919. In 1919, the Bulgarian Christian Rakovsky headed the so-called Ukrainian Soviet government. His attitude towards Ukrainian identity was openly hostile. He considered the decree making Ukrainian the state language as reactionary and unnecessary. Let's take a look at how this happened using the example of Starodubshchina, which was captured by the Muscovites. As early as June 17, 1918, the Chernihiv provincial commandant Yegorov sent a telegram to Kyiv. A commission from Moscow was conducting a survey among the population. They asked who wanted to unite with Muscovy and who with Ukraine. While the population sought unification with Ukraine, signatures for unification with Muscovy were demanded under threat of execution. An even more desperate message came from a direct witness of the Bolshevik Pole, the head of the Starodob district, Kibalchik, who risked his life to send a telegram on July 7, 1918. He reported that the population was in panic, and in the part of the district occupied by the Bolsheviks, people were being slaughtered like sheep. Based on this so-called expression of will, the Bolsheviks claimed as Russian territory the ancient lands of the Starodob Cossack Regiment and the Maglinsky, Novobukovsky, and Surat districts, which are now part of Russia's Bryansk region. During negotiations at the end of February, Ukraine was forced to give up 4 more northern counties. On the other hand, Ukraine's territory expanded somewhat in the east. Part of the Don and Hanrov districts, where Ukrainians were the majority, was annexed to the Donetsk province. In 1919, the Paris Peace Conference began in France, aimed at establishing post-World War I borders. Though late, a delegation from the Ukrainian People's Republic arrived there. They brought with them this map of Ukrainian ethnic lands.
The map is drawn according to ethnographic principles, and it's particularly interesting because it considers Kuban as Ukrainian territory. Contrary to popular belief, Kuban wasn't even formally part of the Ukrainian People's Republic, although it was briefly independent. For instance, on February 16th, the independence of the Kuban Republic was proclaimed. Interestingly, nobody talks about this because in Russia, it's simply forbidden to discuss it. In September 1917, a Ukrainian delegation was invited to a meeting of the Kuban Military Council. They were greeted there in Ukrainian. However, the Kuban region later came under the control of the Russian Volunteer Army and was subsequently occupied by the Bolsheviks. The European leaders of the time, primarily Britain and France, denied Ukrainians their independence. Poland received the Ukrainian regions of Galicia and Volhynia. Later, what actually became the first border in the West during the era of nation-states was the border established by the Treaty of Riga, which had already been concluded between Poland and the Bolshevik representatives of Russia and Ukraine. This was no longer Poland's border with independent Ukraine. It was now the border with the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which shortly after the signing of this agreement became an integral part of the Soviet Union. This effectively transformed it into the border between Poland and the new USSR state. To sign treaties regarding the western borders, the Moscow Bolsheviks finally recognized their puppet state in Ukraine, the Ukrainian SSR, as independent. So they had to establish the eastern borders. On December 28, 1920, for the first time, and specifically within Ukraine's borders, including Taganrog and its mines, Soviet Russia recognized the independence of Soviet Ukraine. And it was within these borders that in 1923 the Ukrainian SSR formally and voluntarily became part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine entered the Soviet Union with these borders, I must emphasize. After the formation of the Soviet Union, negotiations began. Regarding the border change, Ukraine submitted a claim, primarily for Slobozhanshchina, the southern counties of the Kursk region, and several counties of the Voronezh region. Meanwhile, the Russians wanted to reclaim the territories that were transferred to Ukraine in the 1920s. In the 1920s, there was a so-called border leveling process. For some reason, they mostly adjusted the border in Russia's favor, which is clearly visible on maps. This was essentially a straightening of the border. It wasn't based on ethnic criteria, but rather on administrative and geographical factors. At the same time, a large portion of the territories annexed in 1920 were taken away from Ukraine. The Taganrog district, where Ukrainians were the majority, had most of its area taken away. In other words, Ukraine lost territory. Lenin, so to speak, under Lenin's rule, Stalin didn't gift anything, but instead, these aren't just empty words. In 1926, a census was conducted in the USSR. In total, there were 40,300,000 ethnic Ukrainians living in Soviet Ukraine. Of these, almost 8.5 million ended up outside the Ukrainian SSR. It was mainly about compact ethnic groups. First and foremost, this refers to the Kuban and North Caucasus regions. According to the census, there were 900,000 Ukrainians in Kuban. And in the northern areas, our compatriots were forcibly transformed into Russians. This tragic process is vividly illustrated by an incident involving the famous resident of Yeysk, the Ukrainian strongman Ivan Podubny. After receiving a new passport with the surname Podubny, he personally corrected the O to Y and went to the passport office to set things right. The champion of champions returned home only after 15 days, having lost any desire to interfere with national politics. The Russian authorities, who were still quite lenient towards this world-renowned individual. Another densely populated region of Ukrainians was the so-called Central Black Earth region, where, according to the census results, in 1926, there were 1.7 million of our countrymen. Out of them, 1.1 million lived in Voronezhchina. Out of the 33 districts of the Kursk province, Ukrainians were the majority in 8. One of the leaders of the communist Ukraine, Mykola Skripnik, wrote in an article about the boundaries of the USSR in 1928, "We could not anticipate such a stubborn, long-lasting, frankly speaking, disgusting disregard for the interests of national minorities, like for the Ukrainian population in Kursk province, in Taganrog, in Kuban, and so on." No economic considerations arising from the perspective of convenience can justify the state of affairs in the majority of the Ukrainian population in the territories of the RSFR, adjacent to the USSR. A lot of comrades thought that Donbass is not Ukraine and that the workers of Donbass are not mainly Ukrainians. It appears, however, that this is entirely untrue. Almost 3/4 of the miners are Ukrainians. Mykola Skripnik, an article about the boundaries of the USSR. By the way, in 1926, Russians were the majority in only 10 districts across the entire territory of Soviet Ukraine. On September 30th, 2022, Russia attempted to annex the occupied territories of Ukraine. For this purpose, the so-called Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation prepared a decision, arguing that in the 1920s, Russians allegedly lived there predominantly, yet another fake narrative from Russia. On May 3rd, 1939, in Moscow, with the participation of representatives from England and France, Poland, and the USSR, continued negotiations on creating an anti-Hitler coalition. Suddenly, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, Litvinov, was summoned from the meeting room to see Stalin. The father of nations informed the commissioner of his dismissal. Instead, diplomacy was entrusted to the head of the Council of People's Commissars, Vyacheslav Molotov. Negotiations regarding the anti-German coalition continued until August 21st. On this day, the head of the French military mission, Dumonc, excitedly telegraphed Paris with news that the USSR was ready to sign a military pact. Just 2 days later, it became known that a treaty had been signed, but a different one, known in history as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. A week later, Hitler and Stalin, as allies, initiate World War II. Stalin had been conducting parallel negotiations with the French, British, and Poles on one side and Hitler on the other since spring. It seems he had already made his choice by then. The key to understanding this dismissal of Litvinov, whose real name was Meyer Henok Wallach, the People's Commissar. A Jewish minister, understandably, could not sign a treaty with the Nazis. August 31st, 1939, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR ratifies the treaty with Hitler's Germany. Just a few hours before dawn on September 1st, Luftwaffe bombers begin bombing Polish cities, guided by Soviet radio operators from Minsk. A little over 2 weeks later, in accordance with the secret part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Red Army attacks Poland from the east.
Condemned by almost everyone, this secret agreement has found its defenders today. Did the Soviet Union sign a non-aggression pact with Germany? Oh, how bad. But what's so bad about it if the Soviet Union didn't want to go to war? The impact of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was felt directly by Ukraine, as the USSR was expanding at the expense of Galicia and Volhynia. There was even discussion initially about extending further west into the Köln region. That borderline was then altered. Stalin decided that the existing border, established as early as August of 1939, was not suitable. He proposed changing it during negotiations with Ribbentrop in September of 1939, again in Moscow. Let's make a change. Let's swap from Germany's sphere of influence to that of the Soviet Union. Lithuania, which was initially German, now fell under Soviet influence. And for this, Stalin ceded to Germany this land between the Vistula and western Bug rivers. This was essentially the same border that exists today. It is similar, but not exactly the same. For instance, the border between the USSR and Germany at the time ran along the San River, cutting the city of Przemysl in half. The Stalin-Hitler alliance then fell apart. A new anti-Hitler coalition was formed in its place, unified only by the common enemy. For example, this coalition included the Polish government in exile, which relocated to London after the occupation. This structure, led by Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski, firstly had its own vision of Poland's post-war borders, claiming both Galicia and Volhynia, and secondly, demanded answers from the USSR regarding the fate of thousands of Polish army soldiers and officers captured at the beginning of the war. In reality, they were executed on Stalin's orders. In 1943, Sikorski died under mysterious circumstances in a plane crash near Gibraltar. Towards the end of the war, the border issue became critical. Stalin had several aces up his sleeve. First, his troops had already effectively occupied not only western Ukrainian lands, but also Poland itself. Second, the existence of a puppet Polish government created by the Kremlin. An alternative to the official one, and with these Poles, who were essentially Stalin's puppets, a solemn agreement was concluded. This agreement with Poland established the border along the Curzon line. In August 1945, this government signed an agreement that was recognized by everyone. The Americans and British withdrew their recognition of the London government, acknowledging this coalition government instead. Stalin recognized it as well, so agreements were made and this agreement became internationally legitimate. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of communism in Poland, this border was reaffirmed by both a truly independent Poland and a truly independent Ukraine. Despite Khrushchev's efforts, the Köln region and other Ukrainian ethnic lands became merely bargaining chips in negotiations. There was a serious movement for including the Köln region, and this movement was led by none other than Nikita Khrushchev himself. His wife Nina, she was from the Köln region. He was influenced by these family sentiments and Ukrainian patriotic feelings. He even wrote and drafted a project for Stalin to create a Köln region within Soviet Ukraine. Stalin only used this to blackmail the Poles, saying, "There's this hawk Khrushchev. If you don't agree to some reasonable compromises, I'll give him free rein, and you'll lose even more than if you agree to a better deal now." This happened at various times. Bukovina and Bessarabia were annexed to the Ukrainian SSR, while Transnistria was first separated into a Moldavian autonomy and then transferred to the Moldavian Republic. Finally, without any resistance from Czechoslovakia, Ukrainian Transcarpathia was annexed to the Ukrainian SSR. Stalin was the collector of imperial lands. The fact that Stalin gathered these territories, well, it's not really that important actually. Yes, what's important is that the concept of Ukraine is more or less within these boundaries. Together with Transcarpathia, this region was formed long before Stalin's time. Finally, in 1954, Ukraine's current borders were established, including Crimea. The history of Ukrainian Crimea existed even before 1954. Moreover, during the interwar period in that early Soviet Romantic era, when the leaders of Soviet Ukraine still
were playing at some kind of independence before Stalin's repressions and all those events, they also raised the question of annexing Crimea to Ukraine. This wasn't something Khrushchev or some Ukrainian communists invented. At the time of Crimea's transfer in 1954, just 2 years after the death of the all-powerful Stalin, there wasn't yet a cult of personality or absolute dictatorship under Khrushchev, so they were then, together, everyone collectively decided that Crimea should be Ukrainian, although this decision was guided, of course, not by Ukrainian national interests at all. It was primarily driven by economic considerations and interests. After World War II, Crimea was devastated and in ruins. Moreover, when they deported the indigenous Crimean Tatars, they effectively removed a stabilizing factor from the peninsula. These were people who essentially knew what farming in Crimea meant and how to manage it. And in principle, this really was. The decision was absolutely justified because to a large extent, Ukraine took on the burden of Crimea at that time. Borders between countries have always been, are, and will be illogical and unfair. But after World War II, humanity decided not to change them to avoid provoking new ongoing conflicts. Russia, however, is a special case. They say, we don't need what belongs to others, but we won't give up what's ours. Ignorance of history does not absolve one from responsibility.
Слава Україні! Я Олег Криштопа і це історія для дорослих. Підписуйтесь на наш канал та підтримуйте нас на Патреоні.
Привіт, це Альфонс, пілот ударних дронів 68-ї бригади.
Зі мною капелан, зв'язківець 68-ї бригади.
Ми налагоджуємо хлопцям зв'язок, тому що дуже любимо від них чути ось таке.
Є!
Це мед для наших вух, і тому, щоб частіше чути про влучання,
Ми звернулись до благодійного фонду групи 35 та спільноти основних історичних блогерів України.
ми збираємо на 200 FPV для 68-ї бригади.